like many people in Hawaii, we weren't taught this history of what happened to the Hawaiian Kingdom and to Hawaiian people. But I always had a sense that there was something wrong. And when I went away to school in Oregon, that was where I first encountered the kind of really, really violent racism of white supremacists. I encountered the politics of U.S. sort of subversion of countries and their sovereignty in Latin America. The Ronald Reagan's wars of covert wars were going on, and I saw the tragedy and the harm that was causing, and it made me think about how does that relate to what happened to Hawaii? So I started to come back, made my turn to study the history, to get connected to people that were involved in the movement, and made a point to come back and feel the 100th anniversary of the overthrow, and then made a plan. Within like 3 years, I had to come back home and move home. So I did, and started getting involved in work. I worked at the American Friends Service Committee. I don't know if folks here are familiar with the Quakers and their service and social justice work, but the AFSC had a Hawaii office from 1968 until 2011, when the financial crisis forced them to close a number of offices, right? So I was staffed from 96 to 2011. And one of the things that, let me just say that the AFSC has long worked on peace issues, but looking at what are the root causes of violence and war, rather than just symptoms. And in 1968, when the Vietnam War was happening, we first started out helping GIs who were resisting the war. But we soon had to deal with, there were all these other forces and infrastructure and resources going into making war possible, making war likely to happen. And that came to a head in 1976 when a group of activists, Hawaiian activists, did a flotilla to protest the bombing of Kaho'olawe Island. And 9 of them made it to the island, right? Somewhat almost by accident in some ways. It was very unlikely that they would have made it there. Many of them didn't think they would even make it there, but they did. And that act opened a whole possibility for a resurgence of Hawaiian culture, of Hawaiian politics, of resistance, and of a vision of a decolonized, right, a free Hawaii. And so that possibility came about because some folks did an action that disrupted it. Our organization was part of that first landing. Ian Lin was on staff at that time, and he was on that first boat. And so we've been sort of concerned about militarization and these issues for a long time. The militarization of Hawaii makes possible wars in other lands. And so I think that's one thing that I always try to keep in mind, is that we have two kuleana in this kind of work. The violence and harm that's done to Hawaii and the people of Hawaii by this military occupation, but also the harm and the consequences of that militarization for other people. Because the wars and techniques of killing that are practiced here and perfected here get sent to Iraq, Afghanistan, countries in Africa or other places, right? So during the Vietnam War, people in Vietnam looked at Hawaii and they saw the place where the bombers came from. And that was where the troops came from. And so how did Hawaii, right, once a neutral and independent kingdom, become a weapon of empire? Right? And that's, so to really talk about peace and to really work towards peace, we have to begin dismantling that infrastructure that makes war possible. When you look at how a lot of military strategists think about their craft, right, their job, infrastructure and logistics are a huge part of it. Like without all those institutions, the resources, the organization of those resources to be able to fight a war, those wars would not be possible. And so Hawaii plays that kind of really critical role as this hub of command and control, as a place where training and resources and weapons, all of those equipment are assembled and deployed and coordinated. And we are a kind of a center that coordinates with these other hubs to create a web of power around the planet. So I'll get into that a little bit more. But this, so the American Friends Service Committee has worked on these issues for a long time. And when I came on staff, we were working on Mount Valley. So Kaho'olawe had already been won. The bombing had stopped. The cleanup is still incomplete. But Mount Valley is still controlled by the Army. And so that's most of my experience has been working to try to stop that. And then a few years later, the Striker Brigade threatened to come to Hawaii, and they did, and then they left. So I guess we won in a way after all. But at the time when they were coming, it's going to be the biggest military land grab since World War II. And so we tried to organize opposition to that. And so through those experiences, I arrived back at school, and after I leave the AFSC, and I decided, well, I'm going to try to use the university resources as a way to continue my concerns with these issues. So it begins, my concern with these issues of militarization begins with my activist work, but I'm trying to use the tools of Academy to hopefully make it better, more smart. So we're going to talk about Hawaii and the pivot of U.S. empire. Briefly, the outline. I'm going to get into this idea of Hawaii as a pivot of imperial formation, and then Keawalau or Pu'uloa as a pivot of that process of militarization in the islands, and then describe the he'e, the octopus of military in Hawaii, and then quickly sort of go over a broad survey of various sites of resistance, sites of struggle in Hawaii and throughout the broader, well, mostly Pacific, but also other parts of the world where we have allies that we've worked with, and explain why those struggles and being in solidarity with those struggles is really important for the work that we're doing here. So in 2011, President Clinton and Secretary of State Clinton were in Honolulu for the APEC summit. Maybe some of you remember that. Waikiki was a militarized green zone. You had to ID to get through, and Secretary of State Clinton gave an address at the East-West Center where she unveiled the new policy of the Obama administration called the Pacific Pivot, or the nickname was the Pacific Pivot. We're going to shift resources from the sort of European theater to the Asia Pacific, because this was the new sort of center of gravity of geopolitics in the world, with the rise of China and with most of the world's economy traveling across the Pacific. This was the space that needed to be sort of controlled and commanded. But I think for those of us in the Pacific, that was not a new move, right? There's a long history of the United States pivoting. So I want to talk about that in my talk today. This idea of the pivot, though, is it's a trope that has come up in geography. So I'm a geographer. I'm studying in the geography department, and imperialists like to talk about these terms in these very geographic and very structural kinds of ways. So Halford Mackinder was a classic geopolitical thinker of the British Empire. And one of his contributions was this idea of the geographic pivot of history. He said that this area of the Eurasian continent was the most important in the world for basically being the empire that controlled the world. So he said, who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world. So that's how they see geography, as just sort of instrumental or stepping stones to kind of world domination, right? This is what the British Empire was trying to do. But his theory is that geography determines, right, that ability to have power and control. But within geography, it's been pretty much discredited. That idea has been pretty much discredited as a kind of geographic determinism. The idea that geography always determines the outcome has been pretty much knocked down. Except there's still some contemporary proponents, right, that see geography as the determining factor. But I want to play with the idea of pivot. So I don't subscribe to this notion of that your geography is your destiny at all. But I want to play with the notion of pivot, since it was offered to us by Obama. So Archimedes, the Greek philosopher, scholar, said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." Right. So we all know, when you want to lift something heavy, you put a fulcrum, put a lever, and you can lift heavy objects with it. That's how a jack works. So for the United States, Hawaii was a kind of fulcrum for it to do this heavy lifting of dominating large areas of the world. So I wanted to talk about like how that happened. Was it inevitable? Definitely not, right? I don't subscribe to the idea that Hawaii has to be under someone's imperial control. But it does give certain utility for these powerful countries. So I want to play with this pivot idea. But to now shift a little bit and juxtapose that metaphor of a pivot with maybe a more Hawaiian way of understanding these processes. So David Maile, right, his famous quote, when the high tide rises, big fish will come out of the sea and see the small fish and eat them up. So what is he talking about? Who are the big fish and who's the small fish? Right? I mean, he's getting a poetic rendition about imperialism. And it's a warning and a prophecy. It's pretty early in the Hawaiian kingdom. But he's already warning them, watch out, right? Other countries, small fish are getting gobbled up. You have to watch out for this. And what do those big fish look like? Well, here's an example from Senator Beveridge. The Pacific is our ocean. The power that rules the Pacific is the power that rules the world. And that power is and will forever be the American Republic. So, sounds an awful lot like Mackinder's statement, right? But in this case, they're saying that the ocean is, the geography of the sea is critical. And this is, pretty naked imperial ambition on display here about what's really going on. For all the other things that the United States says about why Hawaii needs to be incorporated, really this is what was guiding that whole process. So, but I want to kind of take that idea of a pivot and think of it in other ways too. That Hawaii is a place where different kinds of governance, different practices of using sovereignty and power were experimented and were modulated by the United States. So thinking of it as a place that forces can move back and forth. It can be used and leveraged in certain ways. So I'll talk a little bit about how settler colonialism plays out, the Monroe and / Tyler doctrine, the advent of sea power as a kind of a primary notion, and then the insular kind of empire, domestic in a foreign sense. So one modality of this kind of power is the kind of settler colonial dynamic of the United States, right? The westward movement of the frontier, the annihilation or the extermination of native peoples, right? The taking of their land. And the logic of settler colonialism, as Patrick Wolf talks about, is really about elimination. It's a kind of a different logic than the British, the classic British sort of imperialism, which is more territorial, right? Like if you compare what happens in India, a large subcontinent of people, where the British come in, a minority works with an elite of the native population to govern and rule, and they want resources and labor, right? So it's mainly economic and it's territorial. In the settler colonial sense, they don't necessarily want native people there. They want them gone so that they can have the land, right? And so if you look at the history of settler colonial states, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are kind of classic examples. That's the typical dynamic. The settlers come to stay, they move native people off. And right, so here's this kind of painting of this progress, bringing telegraph wires and railroads and wagon trains, and off you can see here in the darkness being cast out native peoples, right? So this is bringing civilization. This is the other thing about how it gets uniquely cast, I think, in the United States context, as a kind of a religious mission almost, right? It's not just something practical that we need your land, but it also is like, this is natural, it's progress, but it's also it's a duty, it's a religious duty to bring civilization. And if that causes your elimination as a people, extermination, that's just part of that divine will, right? And so that's a really interesting thing because it gives you a way to not be responsible for your actions. To say that it's just sort of a divine requirement, right? In doing that, you also have to, I think most people have a hard time treating other human beings as in a bad way. So you have to kind of like create a justification why I can treat someone in such a way, right? So this idea of othering, right? Who's outside of your gates or your walls or your borders, right? Are subhuman. They're savage. They're primitive. They're other, and that justifies they're not fully human then in your eyes, right? Native peoples were not allowed to own land or have territories or sovereignty because they were just seen as less than, and so it was okay and religiously, supported to take their lands, right? So that kind of logic plays out in the westward movement of the United States, and it makes a leap to Hawaii, I think. President Roosevelt, the most righteous war of all wars is the war with savages, right? So the othering of native peoples was just kind of total. They were outside of civilization. They were outside of law, right? The protection of law. And that's one of the things I think about the imperial process is it forms these borders, and so within the borders, certain rights and powers apply. Outside, it's another regime. It's another thing that's happening. And in the case of native peoples, eventually when the frontier made all this way to the west coast, and then they were enclosed, right? The outside became enclosed, like prisons, like reservations. They're like little bubbles of outside, of foreignness within a U.S. settler state. But the idea of fighting Indians gets transported to other wars and other frontiers. Right? So from the West Coast, now it's Hawaii, next is Vietnam, right? And so, or the Philippines. So Jody Bird is an indigenous scholar. She writes that this idea of the Indian, this kind of figure of an Indian, gets transposed onto other peoples that the United States is fighting against, as a way to also psychologically, symbolically justify what's going on, the violence that's going on. So this is, here you have the U.S. Torturing a Filipino rebel, right, in 1890s, 1900s maybe, I don't know the exact date. The waterboarding that they were still doing to, in Guantanamo and other places. And then the horrible pictures and torture that was going on, because they're not human, right? They can be subjected to this kind of violence. And Robert Kaplan, as late as 2004, saying, that the U.S. is fighting Indians again. So again, the Indian gets put outside and it becomes a justification for war. Now another modality of imperial power that the United States engaged in, and Hawaii represented a really critical pivot point, was the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine was really a kind of an innovation in terms of the craft or the sovereign practices of these imperial states, right? Before the British, they would just take over territories and they would rule it. With the Monroe Doctrine, it was sort of they would recognize, at least nominally, the sovereignty of South American republics. You guys are all sovereign as long as we give you permission to be sovereign, right? And you're not sovereign if you misbehave. I'll send my gunboats in. I will depose your leader and put somebody in who's more favorable to me. So it's a new innovation in terms of how power gets used, because it's like the United States has an exceptional sovereignty over other people's sovereignty. Yeah, and that gets pivoted to Hawaii with the Tyler Doctrine. So the Americas is the United States backyard, and then Hawaii also, right? They pivot to Hawaii, 2,000 miles away. We're also backyard to the United States. So that's where I think the logic of this type of use of power is what it makes it really confusing, because Hawaii as a sovereign kingdom is now under, or at least the United States claims, right? It's under their exceptional sovereignty to decide when and where you are sovereign. You can exercise your independence and your sovereignty, right? And that becomes really key, because if you look at what happens with the organization of the world system after the various world wars, after World War II, the creation of the United Nations, and the way that certain states have a kind of a extraordinary sovereignty over everybody else, is like a global Monroe Doctrine, is what one geographer, Neil Smith, says, right? The UN and the way the world system is organized right now creates a global Monroe Doctrine, where certain states get to decide when I can go and invade your country for humanitarian reasons or for whatever, right? But you can't do the same. It's not mutual. There's not mutual accountability in that. So then Hawaii's also pivot for the kind of military logic or military doctrine. Prior to this, most military doctrine was around land warfare, right? Controlling land, controlling territory, like what Mackinder was talking about. Controlling the heartland was key to having kind of global domination. But Alfred Maile was a naval strategist who, his ideas are still very much in play in military doctrine today. But he recognized that a lot of empires utilized the sea. The sea power was more important in his view. And so, because of that, Hawaii became critical. That he argued that we should take Hawaii. It was not just a sporadic effort, but it's part of a plan, a grand design, right? First fruit of a nation in its evolution, the necessity to carry its life beyond borders, right? So it's an imperial vision that he's talking about as well, but using the sea as the basis, and Hawaii becomes kind of the first stepping stone for that to happen. And then, of course, Roosevelt is a friend of Mahan, and they correspond, and he agrees, yeah, we should take the islands tomorrow. Good. Now, Hawaii is also, so I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping between these different modalities, right? In the case of Hawaii being annexed, or the so-called annexation in 1898, it allows the United States to then acquire these other possessions, right? In the Philippines, Guam, Spain, Puerto Rico, to defeat the Spanish in that war. But there's a kind of a limit to how imperial the United States could be, or how colonial they could be as a republic, right? The big debates of the anti-imperialist league, and the United States is an anti-imperialist country from the beginning. So how can we have an empire? How can we have colonies, right? And so a lot of those contradictions get worked out through Supreme Court cases known as the insular cases, where they basically define these kind of various gradations of colonial status with regard to the United States. And they call, so Hawaii and Alaska get defined as an incorporated territory, as under the Northwest Ordinance. So that means that we possibly have a ticket in to become a state, right? And really that hinges on the presence of the white settler domination of the islands. That they say, well, you could possibly become United States proper if you continue on that development. But these other territories were considered too foreign, right? So they were defined as unincorporated territories that would be forever foreign in a domestic sense. I think I had it wrong the first time. Foreign in a domestic sense. So they're putting these contradictory things together. You're always going to be kind of outside, right? You're always, but you're still a possession of the United States. Chamorro people in Guam can vote and all that. They can serve in the military. They're U.S. citizens, but they can't vote for the president there. They can't. They don't have certain rights, right? And so this is all part of this process of creating these various gradations of colonial subjugation, right, in different degrees. And even among the different unincorporated territories, they all have slightly different variations. And so someone might say, well, that's because it's just kind of absent-minded the way it happened. But I would argue that those variations are all really productive to create different situations that you can't fight together against this imperial power on the same ground. You're all fighting with different tools and different restrictions on you. And so it's just kind of summing up, the Hawaii modulates between these different imperial modes and technique, right? The Monroe Doctrine, Tyler Doctrine. So the overthrow and the U.S. intervention to support this coup d'etat mark the extent at which they would recognize Hawaii as an independent country, right? You're sovereign up to a point, and when we decide we don't want you to be sovereign, we'll take you over. The depiction of Hawaiians as other, as both black or native or savage, is a way of justifying these actions, right? They're not fit, right? The King Kalakaua, Queen Lidu, Kalani were not fit, so of course we have to do these things, right? The incorporated based on the settler colonial presence on the island, and then the transition to sea power. So I rather than sort of, there's all these debates within various social sciences about what is an empire. You know, is the United States an empire? What type of empire is it? Because they're thinking of it as types, right? There's a certain model or something, and does it fit the model or not? I don't think those are as productive, you know, because, and I prefer Anne Laura Stoller's notion of imperial formation. So she says that if you think of imperial formations as something that's always changing and evolving, and that it has the ability to change forms in different places, to apply a certain kind of exceptional logic and sovereignty to one population, you don't have rights as a certain, because of your ethnicity or whatever, or you can be excluded because you're put in concentration camps because you're Japanese, you can be excluded because you're from a Muslim country. You know, that ability to create variations is part of its power as an empire. It's exceptional, and it can do things as it wishes, right? I'll follow the law when I want to, but when I don't want to, I'll invade your country and I'll do whatever, right? And no one can touch me. Even the UN can't touch me because, you know, I'm this imperial power. So that ability to shapeshift is part of what I think imperial power looks like. And it's more, when you think of it that way, then you can see why all these variations kind of make sense, right? All the things that seem kind of contradictory or anomalous can kind of make sense as a way of governing the world. And then also to think of it as this process of becoming. It's never fixed, it's always changing to new circumstances. So an imperial formation. And then Paul Kramer, historian, kind of breaks it down a little further. I won't get into all of it, but he just sort of, you know, reiterates this idea that this asymmetry of power kind of, and organizing space based on this kind of extending power over space and doing it in this hierarchical way. It's creating hierarchies, creating dispossession, creating exceptional differences. These are all kind of these techniques that are being used. And I would say that the United States fits this perfectly. I mean, all empires have utilized some of this, but the United States has taken it to another level in terms of the flexibility that it has, right? So how did Hawaii become, you know, this center of U.S. power? I want to go back to General John Schofield. And he came to the islands in 1872 and 73, did a kind of a tour around the islands. But he had secret orders to spy on the Hawaiian Islands for a suitable location, right, for a military base. And so he writes it, you know, it is the key to the Central Pacific, the gem of these islands, valueless to them, Native Hawaiians or the Hawaiian Kingdom, because they can't use it, but more valuable to the United States than all else the island has to give. What is the it? Where is he talking about? Pearl Harbor, yeah, Pu'uloa, right? So, what was the food basket, the Ainamomona of Oahu, right? A place that had 12 ahupua'a that converge at the water's edge. All the watersheds, the streams that come down, wetlands, lo'ikalo, or the highest concentration of fish ponds on Oahu. That's what he said was not being used, right? That it was useless to them. But of course, you see here, this map was done in 1873. So of course, they did depth soundings in the channel because they wanted to know, can we get a boat in there? Right? So already the plans are working. How are we going to get control of this? Most people, you know, unfortunately know Pearl Harbor as a kind of a place of war, right? Or as a memorial site, a place where you do patriotic pilgrimages. But people don't look at Keavalao Pu'uloa as a place that was this productive landscape, this Hawaiian geography, where you had these beautiful poetic names. I like this one the best, Avavale, right? The lei, the garland of these bays or these harbors, because it forms this kind of a lei. And there's also a place that was really imbued like with female power, right? The Wahine, Mana Wahine. Kala'i Manuia was the mo'i of Oahu who first commissioned the fish ponds in Pu'uloa. It's over, the first one was Lokopa Ayao. It's actually undergoing restoration right now by one of the sister civic clubs over there, and in conjunction with the Navy. But that was the first one built, and then she built all these others. But also the protectors of this place were also, the main ones were female. Yeah? Ahupahao, the shark goddess who protected from the man-eaters, and Kaneko Ana, who brought all the fish and the abundance there, and then protected the fish ponds and the resources, right? And then took it away when people were not pono, right? And so there's no more oysters. Just another map that shows all the ahupua'a, and you know how important water, the when people waiawa, waimano, waiau, yeah. So all these water names and all the sources of fresh water over there. Again, it was an important food basket, but it becomes embroiled in this, you know, all the events that went down, the various stages of the U.S. Overthrow and takeover and occupation of Hawaii plays out around Pu'uloa, or interest in Pu'uloa. Yeah? So 1887, the Bayonet Constitution, so that the sugar planters could secure the second treaty of reciprocity, right? They were afraid that Kalakaua wasn't going to ratify this second treaty, that the United States wanted Pu'uloa and they weren't going to get it. And so this is where, you know, power shifts dramatically in the kingdom. As soon as they take power, they ratify the second treaty of reciprocity, which gives the United States exclusive access to Pu'uloa. So Johnson Osorio calls that the beginning of this dismemberment of Lahui, right, the carving up of the country. Well, y'all are to the story of the overthrow that happens when the Queen tries to rescind the Bayonet Constitution, the Ku'e petition that defeats the Treaty of Annexation. But again, it's war and the military interests that come to the fore in 1898. Even though there's no Treaty of Annexation, a simple joint resolution suffices to seize the Hawaiian Islands, right? And so that's the contradiction that y'all are pointing out in your educational work, and it's still at the heart of our present condition. But that enables the United States, at least in a de facto sense, it enables them to spread their wings from the Caribbean all the way to the Philippines, right? 10,000 miles. Spanish-American War, Hawaii is occupied by a joint resolution of Congress. And so this is the kind of, most people talk about that as the beginning of this American empire period. I think it starts much earlier, from the very beginning of the United States. It was doing empire. But this is a shift, and Hawaii was a pivot point for that to happen. And as a result, today we are the center of the headquarters for the United States Pacific Command, which is the largest and the oldest of the unified commands. Right? And so interesting, they use the same eagle in their logo. PACCOM is right here. That flag is the headquarters up in Halaba Heights, right? The big flag overlooking Pearl Harbor. Its area of responsibility encompasses most of the surface of the planet, right? Because it goes from the west coast of North America to the central Indian Ocean, from up here in Alaska all the way to and including Antarctica falls under the Pacific Command. So, and the majority of the people, the population of the planet, falls within their area of responsibility, right? And so, Kaleko Ka'eo used the metaphor of the he'e. He said that Hawaii would be the head of a monstrous military or imperial he'e that spreads out its tentacles over the region. What that looks like in terms of land use is about 225,000 acres of land throughout the islands. Red and yellow are current and recent acquisitions. Right? So the yellow were all the Stryker Brigade expansion that happened a few years ago. The orange areas are all former military land. So during World War II was a peak of United States military land holdings, something like 640,000 acres. A lot of that was, whatever was returned though, a lot of it is contaminated. So here in Waikoloa, which includes parts of Waimea and all the resorts here, that whole area was used in training and it's a giant contaminated area with unexploded ordnance. So around 108,000 acres, something like that. Bigger than Kaho'olawe. It's going to take, I think they budgeted about $780 million or something like that, taking decades, much longer than Kaho'olawe for, they're going slowly, trying to sweep ordnance. On Oahu, we have many sites, right? Waikane, He'eia, Kahana, all back here in Manuili, in that area. All the offshore islands around the archipelago have been used as training ranges. So there's a long list of cleanup projects that are still going on from that. Our island, nearly a quarter is under U.S. military control. So that's a lot for a small place like this, right? The only comparable places that I know are Okinawa and Guam. About 25 to 30% of their land is military. And so, I think this contributes to some of the conflict and the friction. I mean, it goes back to the overthrow and the use of Gatling guns and U.S. Marines, which is the breaking of the relationship, the friendship between Hawaii Kingdom and the United States. But it's now sort of morphed into all these various locations and various weapons and forces that occupy the island. So to take the metaphor further, the brains of this octopus, the Pacific Command headquarters up in Halawa. Inside, they have these giant screens, the command center, supercomputers. This one in Kihei, right? Processing all this stuff, and the nervous system, or all these fiber optics connecting it all together, right? The eyes of the Hehe. On top of the mountains, most of our mountains have some sort of military tracking station, radar. This one on Haleakala is the Air Force and Missile Defense Facility. They have an optical tracking station. They have other facilities, lasers, Koke'e, Kaena Point, and then y'all seen this one in Pu'uloa, right? The big golf ball that floats around. So they even have a movable eye, right? looks like the eye of Sauron.
Yeah, totally.
Right? I mean, it's a giant. Anybody knows what it is? It's called a radar. It's called a sea-based X-band radar. So it's part of missile defense. It shoots a very high-powered beam in the X-band, which is kind of near the microwave, I guess, area. So imagine a microwave that could, what it does when it touches tissue, right? It burns. It has the same possible effect if something flew into its beam. It sends that beam and it could track a very small object far away, flying through space, right? The idea is that it would track warheads or something flying at you. Problem is, you'd have to find it first, right? You have to know sort of where it's coming. So whenever they do tests, they already know where the launch is going, and so they can sort of track it. It'd be much harder if you are not expecting something. But what it does work really well for, and the other thing is it's been kind of a boondoggle. The Los Angeles Times had a big article calling it a $2 billion boondoggle because as soon as they built it, it started leaking before they even got it to the Pacific, right? They were towing it through the Panama Canal, it started leaking, so they brought it to Pearl Harbor and did fixing on it. It doesn't totally work in all situations when they're doing testing, but what it does do really well is it generates contracts year after year. If you're part of the military, political, industrial complex, if you understand that the economics is what's driving a lot of this, it works really well, right? Because incremental improvements every year means that you'll get appropriations every year. And when North Korea makes noise and the tensions ratchet up, they tow this thing out to sea and they get in and they put out press releases saying, we need more money for protecting Hawaii. And we need a missile launch site on Kauai, right? So it works really well that having North Korea as a kind of a boogeyman to upset and point to helps these guys make money. I think that's a part of the political economics of militarization that is not often talked about. It gets hidden by the geopolitical and the strategic discourse, but the economics are driving a lot. The ears of this octopus under the sea off of Kauai, you have these sensors where they do their war games. Over in Wahewa and Whitmore, have you seen those radomes or radar dishes, right? So it's a communications hub for the Navy. It also connects to the NSA, the National Security Agency, who are doing spying on all of us, right? So, you know, live streaming, they're scooping it up somewhere, texts, phone calls, and it's going into, you know, into their analyst's cave, and then they send it off to Utah or something to be stored. But this is also where Edward Snowden, the guy who blew the whistle, was working. And so he, you know, the government was saying they didn't spy on civilians, they weren't catching all of our communications, which in fact they were, and he exposed that fact, and now is in exile in Russia, right? But Hawaii becomes a really key hub within this whole network of surveillance. And this is a great website to understand some of the connections. The Washington Post did a really good investigative report on top secret America, they call it. And then this octopus, of course, has excrement, right? Takes the crap. And that's best symbolized by what happened to Fu'uloa once Aina Momona is now this. It's a Superfund site. So it's one of the top contaminated sites within the, you know, that's listed for the EPA for cleanup. Within that one big complex, there's hundreds of individual sites. So one time when I counted it, was about 750, close to that. I don't know, the number varies because they find new ones and they clean up old ones. But everything, a toxic cocktail, right? From everything from PCBs, which are carcinogens, to heavy metals like mercury and lead. There's a radioactive cobalt-60 contamination in the sediment of the shipyard because when they remove nuclear fuel from the submarines, some of that stuff gets out, I guess, and it gets in there. And then various petroleum products and solvents like perchloroethylene. So right across from IA Elementary School, there's an empty lot. There was a Navy facility. They spilled diesel fuel and perchloroethylene there. The diesel, they were able to kind of pump it out, but the perchloroethylene hit the groundwater and was like zipping out into IFA. So when they drilled in the water, they found hits of perchloroethylene, right? Which is like a solvent. You would use it to strip motor parts, dry cleaning. It was a dry cleaning facility. But the thing with the rules that govern this stuff for cleanup allow them to get away with stuff that I wouldn't say is not actually dealing with the problem very much. So, for example, the remedy for this perchloroethylene spill is called monitored natural attenuation. Right?
So good.
It's like, it sounds great, right? But it's just watching it and like not doing anything. They're letting nature take its course. I mean, and that counts as a remedy because they're saying, well, no one's drinking that water. It's not exposing anyone to a direct harm. So if they keep it contained there, and, you know, underground and in the water, it gets diluted and it meets the requirements. It's compliant with the law, but it's not necessarily safe or clean, right? And we always ask, like, is it safe? Can we drink it? And like, well, that's not what we're required to do. We just have to make it compliant. One good example is the thing that's been in the news lately, the big Red Hill fuel tank. So this secret facility built in the 40s. Each tank is like 250 feet by 100 feet. Holds 12.4 million gallons of fuel, right? Built in secret. Underground railroad and pipeline connects Red Hill to Pearl Harbor. And all of those 20 tanks have leaked over the years, pretty much. Right? They don't know how much fuel product has been lost. They weren't keeping track in the early days. Later, when they had to keep track, we have some of those records. But the most recent spill was 2014 when they noticed they filled it up with fuel and then 27,000 gallons disappeared. Wow. So they were like, oh, what happened? They're drilling. They're putting, you know, drill holes to monitor and try to find out what went on. The thing about underground aquifers is they're unpredictable. They kind of move around. The rock is different composition. So they don't really know what's happening. Some of the fuel has been showing up in the Navy's water supply. So they're having to clean their water before they feed it to the housing areas down here. But the other stuff that's really scary is that those tanks sit 100 feet above the Halava aquifer. And Halava shaft, which is about 5,000 feet away from that tank and 100 feet down, supplies 25% of our Honolulu's drinking water. From Honolulu to Hawaii Kai, 25% of our water comes out of that aquifer. So if something catastrophic would happen, we'd be in bad shape, right? It'd be really bad. So luckily the Sierra Club filed a lawsuit and they just won, right? Which was great. Basically, the Department of Health governs underground storage tanks. And they say, their rules say it has to be double lined and all of this. But they gave an exemption to the Navy because they're the Navy and they didn't want to go up against them. So Sierra Club took Department of Health to court. Judge said, yeah, you gotta enforce it also on the Navy, which is a good thing, right? The Navy doesn't want to double line these things. I personally think they should just decommission it, right? And just make it into a monument. You could say it's an engineering marvel, I mean, which it is. But, I mean, you know, bring tourists in and, I don't know.
Have a gas sale.
What's that?
Have a gas sale.
Gas sale, yeah. I mean, you know, it's kind of I mean, I'd like to go see it sometime. I've never been in, but it's amazing. You know, the other kinds of negative effects that come out of this occupation, the desecration of places like the Ho'olawe of Makua, of course, is really obvious, but some of them are not so visible. So right here, this guy's golfing on Hawaiian burial grounds, right? In Mokapu, the whole Helenoa sand dunes, one of the largest burial grounds for Iwi Kupuna. And when they built the runway, which is way back here, they cut through the sand dunes, and somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 iwi were removed and put in boxes. They're sitting in the Bishop Museum. For decades now, the families have been trying to repatriate the iwi, but they haven't been able to get an agreement from the Navy or where. So, violations of rights, civil rights. Martial law during World War II is when a lot of land was condemned. This is when all these lands that we were talking about with Makua, Po'akuloa, a lot of those were executive orders that seized those lands. And then also the concentration camps for Japanese and other, you know, enemy aliens during that time, right? The process of militarization, though, is also creeps inside of us, right? It's a process that grabs a hold of us from the inside and changes who we are. And the education process, this education system was a big part of that assimilation, that kind of forced assimilation strategy. So junior ROTC became a requirement for boys in public schools. The first one was set up in Kamehameha schools. So they target the Hawaiian school. The second one was Makili High School, which is Tokyo High, right? Nicknamed Tokyo High. So they wanted to get to that generation of the Hawaiian and Asian men and make them Americans. And so this is what the General Summerall in 1921 there's no better way of securing loyalty, right, than to kind of put them through this kind of education that brings a certain patriotic propaganda and along with the kind of the military disciplining, right? So I think that this is why it makes it really hard sometimes, and it also creates some of the few pathways for people to get out, get an education or get a career, right? The economic draft, the poverty draft that we have forces a lot of our young people to choose that as their only option, even if they want to be a doctor, but they can't afford the schooling, right? And then the social and economic impacts are multiple, and I acknowledge that the military economy is crucial to Hawaii's well-being right now, right? It's about 18% in the estimate of the economy comes from military spending. So, but I would sort of argue that when you have a really lopsided economy that depends on only two industries, you're creating a kind of a dependency or an addiction situation. Yeah? As we know, with addictions, you can't go just cold turkey. You could die from that. Right? So there needs to be a plan of like how you transition to something else. Some of the things that are not talked about though is how the military economy distorts certain dynamics in the community. So like around housing, the high cost of housing that we have, the high rates of homelessness that we have, I think are exacerbated by how military housing allowances work. So a few years back, before, it would be the government that provided housing for troops, right? It would be government funded. But a few years back, they changed it. They made it into privatization. So private companies now come in, run the housing. The military service member and their families will get an allowance based on their rank and pay grade, right? And so it could be anywhere from a couple thousand to like five. Someone said they were getting like 5,000 extra a month on top of your pay. And that way you can pay for a mortgage, you can pay rent, and you outcompete local families who are trying to rent, right? It has an inflationary effect on the cost of housing because if you're a landlord, if you're trying to sell a home, you can push your prices up as high as the market could possibly bear because the government is going to match the market rate, right? So it has that kind of artificial inflationary effect that causes, I think, people to end up like this or moving out of Hawaii because they can't afford it. Yeah. So this is there's winners and losers in this economy, right? There's people who are getting paid in the military economy for sure, but others are paying the price of that. And I would say that who pays the greatest price is Hawaiians, because Hawaiian lands are primarily being used to maintain this infrastructure, right? Majority of those lands that I talked about are the stolen, Hawaiian Kingdom lands, Crown and government lands. And so it's built on that theft. Accidents are a big concern. I'm not going to get into all of it. The kind of violence against women that kind of follows many military bases in Philippines, Okinawa, Korea. We know that this is happening. There's some instances here, but we have very little data. No one's really studying and looking at how militarization has an effect on women. And then the tentacles, right, are reaching out. So Okinawa, long time, very highly militarized and long resistance movement. Here's Futenma Air Base, Marine Corps Air Base, surrounded by Ginowan City, one of the most dangerous military bases in the world. Okinawans are trying to push the bases out, and so the U.S. says, well, let's move some to Guam, right? 9,000 troops and their families, all the workers. It would have raised Guam's population by a third if all of that were to come to pass. There was resistance, and they've changed some of those numbers, so it's come down a little bit, and they're still fighting over particular sites. But this is kind of how it happens. Kwajalein, all the islanders are squished into Ibai Island. They were moved off of Kwajalein so that the U.S. could have a missile base, right? This is Pyeongtaek, Korea. This whole village, and you can see there are rice fields in there. The whole village was wiped off the map to expand Camp Humphreys. They were expanding the army base. And this is part of the confrontation when the villages were doing an occupation, and many of them got arrested and hauled off. And the South Korean government is pretty militarized too, right? So they just came in and started beating people up. But that village doesn't exist anymore. And tentacles, you can cut off, if you catch it and the tentacle comes off and it gets away, it grows back, right? So Subic Bay, Clark Air Base in the Philippines, U.S. was kicked out, but now the advisors are coming into Mindanao to support the war on terror. And now that China is becoming more of a rival to the United States, we've seen U.S. expanding its presence in the ports again and building up their infrastructure. So, as Kalekoa says when he described the head the first time, when you catch a head, you gotta neutralize the head, otherwise it's gonna keep going, right? So we have that, I guess that kind of extra burden here in Hawaii is to deal with the things that emanate from here, right? So I'm shifting a little bit to just talk about some of the recent struggles or issues that we've had. So the Striker Brigade was one that we fought from about 2000, just after the September 11, the war on terror. There was this big expansion, and would have been the largest expansion of the military in Hawaii since World War II. 25,000 acre land grab, basically, in order to station 328 of these armored vehicles. We fought them in court, we had protests, we won in court. The Army failed to do an adequate environmental study, but in the end, they just did another study and they just decided the same thing, right? So they already decided it was going to happen a certain way. But ironically, now that the Army's facing budget cuts and they're cutting back, they say, oh, well, it's too expensive to have strikers in Hawaii. We'll move them to Washington, right? So we won in the end, but they still didn't give back those 25,000 acres. So, yeah. Missile defense, right? So they're talking about making the test range in PMRF in Kauai operational. They want to actually have operational missiles there now. And so the conflict with Korea is productive for them to push that agenda, right? Trump just put that into the budget request. But this is like a playground for the defense contractors. You know, they've limited access to fishing, surfing, all these areas, and they test all these kind of weapons over there, right? So various kind of missiles, but they're also firing lasers, high-powered lasers, which a UH professor who does laser research, the Navy wanted to use his technology, and he refused because he said it would be dangerous to the people on Niihau to be using a laser, you know, in that vicinity. So they got another laser. Right? Hypersonic weapons. They have these weird missiles now that fly at something like 7 times the speed of sound. So they're testing these in the skies of Hawaii. Air-breathing hypersonic weapons. The Osprey is another recent expansion, right? So they're bringing 24 of these tilt rotor crafts. Very dangerous. One of them crashed in Bellows a few years ago. They've had many accidents, but the Marines really want it. And in order to train this, they stationed at Mokapu, but they trained Bellows. They wanted to train in Kalaupapa. I think people nixed that, they protested, and so that one got taken off. But Pacific Missile Range is being used, Niihau, and also Pohakuloa for training. There's been new resistance coming up in the Big Island. So Ku Cheng and Maxine Kahaulileo filed a lawsuit to challenge the state, because the state is the landlord for several, I think it's like tens of thousands of acres of state-controlled ceded lands that the military leases for $1 for 65 years. Right? The state, as the landlord, should be maintaining the integrity of those lands, right? And they have a fiduciary duty. The Army, as the tenant, are supposed to keep those lands pristine so that when it's returned, it's in original condition. So on that basis, these plaintiffs are suing the state and saying, hey, you're not fulfilling your duty to make your tenant abide by the conditions, right? Of course, the lease is written in such a way that the state has very little power, but it at least puts some leverage and it raises this issue. The leases come due in 2027, Makua, Pohakuloa, and so I think this is one thing that we need to push for, is to end the lease already. You know, I know the Army is trying to renegotiate already early, so we need to step on that. But you know, the thing that's happening because Oahu, we've had successes with some of the resistance, and the Army feels squeezed here. They're moving a lot of their training to Pohakuloa, because it's a bigger space. The Marines are also setting up shop there, building new ranges, and so that's where I think the greatest threats are happening. And it's just hard because it's such a big area, and it's really inaccessible. We don't see it happening. Although people in Waimea hear the bombing. The other thing that's happening though is that there's a new generation of resistance of young people, the protectors of Mauna Kea. So like Ruth Alawa and Havani Rios and all these guys were that generation who went up and protected Mauna Kea in these last few years. Mauna Kea and Pohakuloa sit in the same ahupua'a. It's all kaohe, right? And so they're saying, these are connected struggles, even though they're different, dynamics, different threats. But it's energizing the Pohakuloa resistance. So maybe we'll see some more action coming up this summer when RIMPAC arrives. Of course, the PKO was kind of the opening, like I mentioned, the pico of this resistance. When 76 they landed, right? So this picture from 76. But it's still an incomplete project, I mean, $400 million and 10 years of work to remove the unexploded ordnance, and only 1/10 of the island is actually subsurface cleared. And so, I think we need to keep pushing the Navy to do more. Unfortunately, the way that it was funded was a special legislation, so there's less leverage on the Navy to get them to clean up stuff. it was a trade-off. They wanted the land returned first. Right? PKO wanted the land returned first, so special legislation did that. But it meant the Navy was off the hook after like 10 years. After the funding was out, they're out. So that's a tricky one. But it has many lessons. This is one of the things I'm studying for my dissertation. Is what were the lessons? What was gained? What should we learn from the experience of Kaholawe that can be applied to some of the other sites we're dealing with? And then Makua Valley, as I mentioned, we've held off training now since 2004. And we've had makahiki ceremonies since 2001. And so I think there's been a lot of progress in terms of letting the land heal, opening up access to cultural practice. And it's a matter of time before Makua will come back. But I believe that the Army's holding on to it as kind of like collateral so that they can do the things they want in Kuakaloa. So we're not going to give you back Makua until we get someplace else to do this, right? So technically though, once the environmental study and the lawsuit and all that stuff works its way out, and the court says, okay, you've fulfilled your requirements, technically they could still say, okay, we're going to go train again. So we need to be prepared, I think, to fight that in case that happens. But I don't think it's likely. Yeah, I think it's going to be too much opposition. And it's become a little kipuka for cultural revival and resistance. I'm going to kind of zoom out now and just kind of talk about how Hawaii fits into a larger context. So the U.S. has over 800 military bases in 70 countries around the world. Yeah. So we were one of the first. I think Guantanamo Bay in Cuba was maybe the first. Pearl Harbor was the second one, one of the second. Right? So again, the pivot of this imperial process, we were an early example, an early prototype of regime change. These are the bases and deployments in the Asia-Pacific region. Right? So it's not just Okinawa, Japan, and Korea, but a lot of other countries that are dealing with these military bases. But there's also, because this is a global problem, activists have realized that they need to also have a global resistance, right? So there's been these networks of different groups fighting these things locally who are linking up. And one example is the International Women's Network Against Militarism. So they have meetings periodically in different locations to raise awareness and to support each other. The last one they just had last year was in Okinawa. So. Some other examples, in Vieques, Puerto Rico, a little island off the coast that was bombed by the Navy, almost the same size as Kaholawe, except there's about 40,000 people living on the island. And so they had high rates of cancer, all kind of problems, and an accident that killed a civilian worker led to the most recent uprising against the Navy. And so between 1999 and 2003 is when it stopped. There was waves of protests, and some of us from Hawaii went there to support them. But there was a longer history of solidarity going back to the 70s. In 76, 77, activists from PKO went to Vieques to support them. And so when we arrived, and we went into the bombing range, there were activists had their camps, and we were stepping over, mortars and all this kind of stuff, right? One of the fishermen saw the t-shirt. I was wearing a PKO t-shirt. He saw the logo. He goes, I met your people back in 77 or something like that. When he got out of jail, there were PKO guys there to greet them and extend solidarity. So it's like these connections are really important, yeah? Even though they're over distance and over long periods of time maybe, they keep the spirit alive, and they help us exchange ideas and strategies. So they were successful. They stopped the bombing, but the cleanup hasn't progressed that much. Yeah? They don't have Inouye. It's part of their problem, right? Kaholawe was partly because Inouye was able to leverage funds. They don't have that kind of leverage, so they're still dealing with trying to get money. In Okinawa, another island, they're kind of like they say we're doubly colonized by Japan and by the United States. Right? And most of the US bases in Japan are all concentrated here in this tiny little island. The area is about the same as Oahu. And so what's happening is there's a plan to move, where is the Futenma Air Station, move it up to Henoko over here. But in '95, when the 3 U.S. Marines raped an Okinawan girl, it sparked a huge uprising against the military. So there's been waves and waves of protests, and it forced the U.S. and Japan to kind of renegotiate their arrangement, right? So they want to move Futenma, close it down, and it's a very dangerous military base. There's been accidents, and you can see how close the homes are to the airfield. They want to move it from here to Camp Schwab in the north, right, and build a runway over the edge of the reef. But this is what it looks like. This is what's going to be destroyed. Coral reef, habitat for the dugong, endangered mammal. And so there's been pretty sustained and fierce resistance by the Okinawans. Every day they're sitting down in front of the gates and they're getting hauled away. They're going out in the sea and trying to get into the controls area with kayaks, and they're getting, pulled off and everything. But it's just kind of cat and mouse game constantly. The construction has started though, so I don't know where it's at this point, how much has been destroyed, but there's still pretty inspiring struggle. But because of that protest, I mentioned how the troops are going to be moved to Guam. Here you have 27% of the land occupied by U.S. bases, right? Chamorros are about a third of the population, so it's going to be having a large influx of settlers, of military personnel, will create similar kind of problems that happen here, right, with the population transfer of military. They fought off and won. There was a proposal to build a firing range in a sacred site named Pagan, and they organized and were able to stop that proposal. But now the Marines are proposing to take this other area, kind of a coastal rainforest, known as Litexian, up here in the north. So it's got beautiful forests, endangered species, and so this is the new fight. They're trying to stop that one. There's a group called Proteji Litexian that's organized, and so that's ongoing. And also in the Northern Marianas, right? So they're all part of the same culture, same history, but politically they got divided because of colonialism. In the Northern Marianas, the island of Pagan and also Tinian are being used for military. Well, Pagan, not yet. They want to take over Pagan and turn it into a bombing range. And it's a beautiful, it's called like a gem of the Pacific. It's all kind of pristine forest there. So Chamorros there are also organizing and resisting. And we're trying to connect these various struggles. And I mentioned, Pacific Missile Range, it connects with what's going on in Korea, right? So even though Korea is probably South Korea is probably more in the path of destruction if a war breaks out between North Korea and the United States, they're very much against having these radars and missiles deployed to their soil. So this village of Songju, the U.S. wants to put THAAD missiles, anti-ballistic missiles, in, and there have been uprisings against that. They're constantly resisting. And then in Okinawa, because of the accidents, Okinawans have been resisting the Osprey helicopter. So they're kind of surprised actually that there's not more resistance here in Hawaii, because we've had accidents, right? But I don't think people here have been tuned into how dangerous these things are as they happen there. And so I'll wrap it up with just a short story. So one day, you all know Edward Makanani? He's a kind of a famous activist. He's been in the Kaho'olawe movement for a long time. He was also one of the original voyagers on Hokulea. He kind of tends to blow in and out of town. Like, he'll just sort of show up and be like, hey man, what's going on with Makua? He called me up one day. He said, you guys went up to a meeting, I can catch a ride with you. So I'm driving with him out to Waianae, and we're talking story. He goes, you got a haku. And I was like, okay, I didn't really understand what he meant, but haku is what you compose, you haku a lei, you kind of weave it together. So I thought, this is what my interpretation was, that we need to weave together the various strands of our struggles, whether Viekis and Okinawa, to Pohakuloa and Makua and Kaho'olawe, into fibers that are stronger than the individual strands, right? Like this is part of the kind of wisdom of these crafts in the Pacific, is that by making kaula, you can tie a hale together to withstand storms, or you can tie a va'a together that can traverse the ocean, and you can hopefully we can make a net that's big enough and strong enough to capture those big fish that are threatening to eat us all. So, thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, any
Comments?
questions or comments? Sorry, it's kind of long, yeah?
No. You want to speak to the peaceful?
Oh, yeah. I mentioned that. We have a great opportunity. Okay, so this summer, right, this is the year when the RIMPAC exercises, the largest multinational military training exercises, take place in Hawaii. They use a lot of our beaches, oceans, areas, and all these other countries come and shoot the aina up, right? During the Kaho'olawe struggle between in the 80s, every 2 years there was a protest against the RIMPAC, and they also did tremendous solidarity work with the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific movement. So that in Australia and Canada and Japan, groups were also protesting against their countries' participation in the bombing of Kaho'olawe. And they were able to get some of these countries to pull out of this exercise. And eventually, when the bombing stopped, it was a win. So, RIMPAC is happening this summer, but we also have the opportunity to host the anti-nuclear sailboat known as the Golden Rule. So, this is a really amazing story if you haven't heard of it, right? In 1958, as the United States was doing nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, atmospheric testing, a group of Quakers decided that they were going to protest. It was unacceptable. They had tried other means of protesting the nuclear program, and it hadn't had any effect, so they wanted to do something more dramatic, a nonviolent direct action. And so they sailed this boat, the Golden Rule, from California to Hawaii. They were at the Alii Boat Harbor, and they were going to sail into the nuclear test zone in the Marshall Islands in protest. They let everyone know we're going to do this thing. And so as they were leaving, they got caught by the Coast Guard. The captain was thrown in jail. The crew tried to make another run for it, and they got out of port, but they were in international waters, but the Coast Guard apprehended them, put them in jail. It just so happened there was another family that was doing a round-the-world voyage on this boat called the Phoenix of Hiroshima. The father was a doctor who did his research on the effects of radiation on children in Hiroshima. And so he was so moved by that he was like, he became an activist, an anti-nuclear activist. And as they're doing this around-the-world voyage with his family, they happened to be in port at the same time this Golden Rule action was going on. They went to the trial. They were inspired by these men that were taking great risks. They said, well, we got to do something about this. So they sailed to the Marshall Island test zone and got in there. They went into the test zone, the restricted area, and got apprehended. A 2-year trial ensued, where he was convicted, and then it was overturned. Because why? It was illegal for the United States to impose a restricted zone on international waters. They couldn't have done that, right? So they ended up winning, and the family did some amazing things. The mother is honored in Hiroshima for her work on peace and various things. So those two boats kind of drifted out of memory over the years. But in 2010, the Veterans for Peace organization found out that the Golden Rule was like a derelict in Northern California. It was broken, it had sunk, and they decided they're going to restore it. And so 3 years later, they launched the renovated Golden Rule, and they've been sailing it up and down the West Coast to do education and raise awareness about the threats, and well as participate in actions, right? So this summer, in June, they're going to embark on a trip across the Pacific. They want to finish their mission that they never got to finish, right? And so they're going to come to Hawaii, spend a few months here, sailing around the islands, port stops in different places, activities, taking small, short sails, and then they're going to go to the Marshall Islands. They're going to go to Guam, Okinawa, maybe Jeju Island in Korea, Japan, possibly North Korea if they can get in. So it's going to be several years that they're going to be at sea. They want to be in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 2020, the 75th anniversary of the nuclear bombings there. But this summer we'll have them here. And so this is an opportunity to do protests and various kinds of education. But we would like to invite Hui Aloha Aina o Honolulu if you'd like to participate in planning and hosting some activities.
Are they going to impact?
Yeah, so I think, we don't know.
Interrupt the,
I don't know if they're going to do anything that's too dangerous, but I think at least in a symbolic way to be doing things visible against what's happening.
what they're doing.
Yeah, we don't know yet what all the plans are to plan that. And we have to be a little bit security conscious about that too, right, with our planning.
Yeah, Honolulu will be coming, if I agree.
Sorry?
Towards the end of June.
Yeah, and they're going to
Coming through.
depart early June, probably get here by end of June, and then spend a few months, they said. So be a chance to get school kids. We're trying to connect with the various canoes of the Voyaging Ohana in Hawaii.
No,
Reaching out to them, but it's not, they can't be bothered with things on board. But some other ones, like the Kanehunamoku Voyaging Academy, they have a smaller vaha that they use for education. We've been in touch with Bonnie Kahape, the captain, and they're excited to work with us. So we're hoping we can connect with other of the voyaging groups, as well as the various struggles on the different islands. Yeah.
You bring my kayak.
Oh yeah. Big flotilla. I think that would be awesome, right?
The more we have,
they're
the
doing.
better, right?
Picture this: Bellows Beach. The big ships come and amphibious landing, and then one flotilla of kayaks and a peace boat goes out there and makes a statement, right? I don't know. It's good optics anyway.
Great.
So, so that's an opportunity. I really want to invite folks to come out and participate.
Mm.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, not long ago, that they had, what happened to the Ku'e petition shovel?
I'm sorry.
Oh,
The next question.
I think they're going to join that,
Oh,
the sale. We have a sale.
Oh, for real?
Yeah.
the Ku'e, we have a sale, they made the sale already with the Ku'e.
Oh, with all the names.
Sale with the names and
Yeah.
And then that should be one of them.
Yeah. So so there's many kind of connections that can be made with that.
Mm-hmm.
And given the nuclear false alerts and fire and fury and all that kind of stuff, it's a good time to be talking about like disarmament and diplomacy.
Well, in that mode, I don't understand. I think the administration right now is talking about making mini nukes.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain that? How is a mini nuke any better than what we've got?
It's not. It's more dangerous, really, because it makes it deludes us to think that they're usable, right? The part of the craziness of the Cold War was the overkill of it that made it impossible to ever use this thing, right? So that was the mutual assured destruction that was a deterrent to actually using it. But now when they're saying, wow, we could do mini nukes, we could do first strike, preemptive strike, that's really dangerous, right? Because it upsets the whole, the balance of terror, they call it.
I don't know about the tactical nuclear weapons. I think the other issue too is that if you're on a battlefield and you have these weapons in your possession, and all of a sudden you're going to be overrun, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with these weapons?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to launch them. You're not going to let the enemies
Yeah.
possession of them. I think that increases the risk.
Yeah.
The other issue I got, is that you may be able to do this in the military, but I don't think appealing to their ethics and what is right makes the smallest amount of difference to them.
Mm-hmm.
For most of the military guys, they're here for 4 years and they don't give a rip about what's going to happen to this place after that. They're going to be gone.
Right.
They don't care. And the prime example I see for that, Camp Lejeune,
Yeah.
the water was contaminated. The Marine Corps, the families, the Marines.
Well, Marine Corps Base Hawaii, the families getting sick over there.
And
Yeah.
they knew about it, and they didn't do a blessed thing about it until it hit the news. And all of a sudden, oh, to track all these guys back for 30 years because the water was contaminated. They don't care. They don't care about their own people. You look at, the nuclear tests, in Micronesia. You've got these guys in these boats, and they're blowing nuclear bombs on. They're standing on the boats, or they're in trenches. They don't care.
But I think you just pointed out, like, there's a contradiction within the military itself, right? Where the people making these decisions may not care about the harm they're causing to their own people, but those people, I think, can be reached. And this is where so many of the Hawaiian activists came out of the military and were radicalized by the experience and the contradictions they saw in there, right? And just like, with our work, sometimes we think, wow, why are we standing out here with science again? Like, what does it really do, right? But I've talked to at least two GIs who came out as anti-war, military personnel. One guy was Iraq Veterans Against the War, and I asked him, why did you, what was the turning point for you? He said he was on a bus going into Makua Valley one time, and he saw a group of people protesting outside, and he was like, wow, why are we doing this in this beautiful place? What's going on here, right? Like, that was kind of like the little opening that happened, and then he turned around and became like, I'm against this war. The other guy was also Iraq Veteran Against the War. We had the protests at Kukani Local against the Striker Brigade. So all these Hawaiians are marching and protesting against the strikers, and he kind of showed up just sort of low-key and to observe. But he said that was the beginning of awakening for him about why are we here in Hawaii? What are we doing here? What's going on in Iraq? Right? And he came out against the war. So you never know, I guess, what seeds are planted and when they germinate and when they grow. And so, and there's been very strong GI resistance movements, right, from the Vietnam era, but even more recently, these coffee houses, I mean, they're now, I think they're having trouble sustaining themselves, but, that kind of GI resistance and education is really key. So I would welcome that more in Hawaii.
Yeah, all on the same lines. That we're the stewards of Kanyakapuku, right?
Yeah.
So one day we're up there doing our usual thing on Sunday, right? And a bunch of these young guys with crew cuts come in, right? They march in. It turns out these guys were rim pack sailors. And they were going to, Jackass Ginger or whatever, and somehow they got lost, right? So they end up coming up the trail, coming up to Kanyakapuku. Like, what are we going to tell these guys, right? I mean, you guys invaded us, right? You're occupying our country. Like, how do I approach these guys, right? It's the USO. And the emphasis was that, look, you love your country. In 1893, the Kupuna loved their country. They didn't want to be invaded. Would you want your country to be taken over and occupied by a stronger foreign power?
Right.
And these guys were like, wow, we didn't know this.
Right.
We didn't know this. And we took a non-threatening approach.
Yeah.
And most of those guys went back saying, gosh, we got to look into this some more. What happened?
And I think that's a good point about this occupation. Doesn't look like an occupation to most people, right? Mm-hmm. Who think about like an occupation as something like what happens in Gaza, or these other places that are war torn, that the violence is more overt and in your face. And here, it doesn't look like that, but it doesn't mean it's any less violent in terms of the structures of control, or the dispossession that happens, right? So the kind of the cultural genocide that goes on with the kind of cultural erasure. So, but it's just that it gets sort of masked, and this is where military and tourism in Hawaii go hand in hand too. One hides the other, right? And so, yeah, it's hard for people to know. There's no reason for them to know because they've never had the information, or there's no way to get access to it sometimes, yeah. So it's good you guys do this kind of stuff.
Just have a personal note. 2016, August 2016, my wife and I, Suzanne, we went to honeymoon in Korea. And there was a gathering also of adoptees there. But the day before we left, in the King Sejong Boulevard, with the statue of King Sejong, there's a large reunification rally there. The table set up and all, and reunification flags and all that stuff. Then that evening, in front of the city hall, which is there's a large, huge lawn there. It's like at least 1,000 or so, maybe a couple thousand people. They're protesting the U.S. military because they were showing films of a huge screen of planes flying and stuff and protests from different villages, Pyeongtaek being one of them. And it's and I asked one of the people that was holding the unification flag, what it was all about, because it was in Hangul, Korean language, and that's what he was saying. Is the protest against the U.S. military bases. And people are like throwing their arms up in the air, little what they call them, wand things. Anyways, that was their personal life.
Cool.
So hopefully things like that, considering what's happening, it probably could happen after the games in the U.S. with their more.
I mean, that's why I think that the globalization also provides opportunities for new connections to be made, right? The fact that Standing Rock, people from all over can be in solidarity and virtually in solidarity, doing stuff in their own place. Even Mauna Kea and how that thing went viral. So like using technologies like this to link us up is a tool that amplifies our power, and I think that's good. It's also a vehicle for them to surveil us, so we got to be careful about that, right? But I think we have new constituencies that we can count on, and that's part of my point about these networks is that we never had access to those kinds of networks in the same way that we do now. So how do we build a global movement that can change how we do geopolitics?
Do you get a lot of pushback for the work you do from government or whatever?
Sometimes, we've been surveilled, and I'm sure we have files that, they keep us out of certain meetings and stuff. So we get branded and targeted, but I haven't had anything really bad happen like some people.
Being kept out of the meetings, not.
Well,
I mean, you haven't had like really overt kind of action against you.
Well, give you an example. This is, I think this is some of the new techniques of how they control. So, remember how I was saying the forms of violence are not necessarily so overt, and often they involve a certain amount of persuasion and co-optation, right? So when we were fighting against the Stryker Brigade, we were trying to get, we were going to hearings. I mean, these are just EIS hearings that we always do, and we would bring signs and we give our testimony. We didn't expect that it was going to be that big of a deal because often these things are meant to absorb resistance, right? They give you a venue, you can shout it and whatever, and then they go on. But they had this, they set it up at private locations, and they were saying, oh, you can't bring signs onto this private location. So, well, this is a public meeting. Why can't we, this is part of our testimony, right? And the guy's like, no, you cannot, big security. So we crossed the line and we got arrested the first night. Second night, people got arrested. And then they finally changed it because it really kind of blew up in their face. But it was the people that they hired, they would hire like Native Hawaiian consultants who would become like the agents, right? And so what they did is they would organize other Native Hawaiians who would be consulted. So instead of having to listen to our resistance and opposition, they would have other Hawaiians that they support them, organized, and then they would consult.
Like Mauna Kea.
Like Mauna Kea, right? So those are the new evolution of these techniques where they know they have to consult, they know they have to include certain participation by these constituencies, but they will just produce their own Hawaiians or own environmentalists or whatever, right? And often by throwing money at stuff, you can either neutralize opposition or by their participation in things. So, and what happened is we were then not invited to meetings anymore after we kept trying to push our way in, and there was a meeting to discuss an EV issue that the Army wasn't going to make public, but some folks had heard about it, and so we were pushing, right? And they had a meeting to discuss what was going to happen with this under the NAGPRA law. I went to the meeting, and the MP said, "You're not invited to this meeting." And I was like, well, when I see this other guy's going in, right? This other guy, he's Japanese, and he's part of another group that's like, how come he can go in, right? Well, you're not invited. And so my friend was speaking up for me inside the meeting, and she got sort of like physically removed from the meeting, told to leave. So they're deciding whose voice matters, right? Again, this whole idea of variable kinds of treatment. Certain peoples get certain access, certain peoples get certain rights to speak and to be heard, and certain peoples get marginalized. And we see that happening all the time with how the homeless are treated and various things. So I think, it does happen, but it happens in these kind of sophisticated ways that make it look like it's not really about repression.
So do you feel that the movement to peace as a unifying factor in the movement like this? Say your networks?
I mean, I don't know. I think most people like peace,
But I don't know, but do you feel
There's no money in it.
You find that to be kind of offsetting their, I mean, they got all the guns and all the money.
Oh, right. I see what you're saying. Okay. I mean, I guess that's the lessons of Martin Luther King and Gandhi was to use that kind of a political and spiritual jujitsu almost, right? The smaller force, again, using a fulcrum. You tip the opponent over and you flip them when their force comes at you. You use physics against them in that way. So I think in some ways that's what nonviolence does, is tactically, you're taking the force of this opponent and you're showing how it's illegitimate, right? That power is illegitimate in the eyes of the world that watches this event happen. And meanwhile, our power is also about how we spread underground. Like I think one of the things, I like mushrooms. I like mushrooms, and I like mycelium, because mushrooms are these kind of complex organisms that their bodies are mostly underground, right? And they're growing and they're changing the environment, making it more habitable, creating better communities of all different species, and then sometimes they emerge. And I think our movements are kind of like that. Like we're creating ecosystems, changing, how we relate to each other. All the relationships are changing in these kind of meetings like we're having here, in events that we do, gatherings on the palace grounds, right? All these connections are happening, and then sometimes they emerge in occupying an island to stop the bombing, or blocking bulldozers on a mountain. And who would have known that it would have happened? It almost was by chance in some ways, but yet it wasn't, right? There's already this kind of network that was forming. So I don't know. I think when you're at a disadvantage in terms of the kind of weapons and power and money and stuff like that, we have to move in different ways. And some of that is, I think it's this kind of mushrooms.
Yeah, kind of about the haku you're talking about, those underground organizations and the connections. Just to kind of share something about the history of like how Standing Rock happened. Red Warrior Camp, which a lot of people knew about, was Standing Rock. What happened was there was a connection with our Kiai here in Mauna Kea, and there were some people, Crystal Rain Tubles, came over. She was part of the Ochatishakoa and Lakota Dakota nations, and she came and she stood with our people up on the Mauna. And so they took the idea of water protectors from our Kiai, from our word protectors, and they brought that back home. LaDonna Turnbull, she became close because of that whole situation with Pua Case, and in a separate conversation was like, hey, I need to try and protect our lands against the DAPL construction. And she said, what you do is call people and invite people in, like we invited people out from Mauna Kea. And utilizing the same type of, media strategies, we got the Mauna Kea Ohana folks who came up and We had a Hawaii person that was the head of the president of the Water Protectors Legal Collective. I helped start the Standing Rock Medic Healers Council. We did all of the medical and healing needs on the front lines. We had Mikey, who was the head of security for Chichangu camp. You know, so you had all of these people, and then when you look at the song that they had about, you know, from Taboo did about Standing Rock, he says, "Men rise up as kiai." You know, and so this is the, you know, the connection that we have. There was all these connections that was happening, and not, you know, certainly there was 1,000 other different inspirations that made Standing Rock happen. There was a whole bunch of different nations that were part of it, but we were really intrinsically in there from the very beginning. And coming back to the, you know, reaching out to the veterans, you know, the part where they really got terrified is when they had 10,000 veterans descend upon Standing Rock to become a peaceful protective guard against, you know, the militarized Morton County Police Department. So if we can start, you know, these are things that happen. You know, certainly Standing Rock community had no idea what they would eventually become. You know, people didn't know what Mauna Kea would become. It's this rising of that, you know, mycelium from below that really was because of this fertile ground that everybody had been feeding all throughout the decades, and then it just pops up, and those of us who are involved with it are often surprised ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it catches you off guard sometimes.
Yeah, like, oh my, like imagine like there's this town, you know, Standing Rock tribe was like total of maybe about, you know, 7,000 people. You know, they have an average income of about, is it $8,000 a year or something like that. This is a very poverty-stricken, completely isolated community that had at its peak, you know, the Chatishakuan camps and all the camps were about, you know, 15,000 people. It's like it was dwarfed the whole entire population of the
global phenomenon.
It was a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
So like they certainly were thinking that was going to happen, but right now it's still, you know, going. Right now there's people, the divestment is something I can't remember, like it's like $10 billion worldwide. Like you have whole countries are shutting down from fossil fuels. You know, this is a movement that people think just went away. It's still going right now. So there's still an ongoing process right now where people are still fighting for it. You know, so this, you know, all these things that we're talking about, the haku is so powerful because it was really, that was the only way that it was made possible.
Yeah. Thank you. I didn't know that. That's cool.
That's
Really cool.
Will you tell Pao?
Any other questions?
That's awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the good time.